Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to the Saturday Talk. My name is Nock Acker and we have Deborah Bronk speaking today from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. She's going to be giving a quick overview on how science is funded and done here in America. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. Okay, so I kind of threw this together quick, so I hope this is smooth. So how I'm going to go through this is I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself, then the job. So as a researcher, what is my job? There's a lot more parts of it than just doing research, and that's true of most scientists in the U.S. Kind of what the nuts and bolts are of how science is actually done in this country, and then some of the big challenges that the sciences have right now. So where I come from, I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But I pretty much grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. You'll notice neither of those places are anywhere near the ocean, so I wanted to be an oceanographer since I was a little kid, though, watching Jacques Cousteau, who ironically is not an oceanographer, but I didn't know that at the time. So what are the jobs? So all the different parts of my job, at least, researcher is the most important thing that I do. I'm a reviewer, and I'm going to go through each one of these. A mentor and a teacher, a committee member, both for my university and for national committees. And then I'm involved in scientific societies, which is a lot of scientists are involved in that. So I've got some leadership positions there. But again, a lot of people do. So as a researcher, this is my favorite one. This is the first time we came up here, and we're the nitrogen snow ninjas. This is me in the middle. This is Quinn. Quinn just had a baby, so she is not up here this year. Stephen is out on the ice right now, probably freezing his. It's probably really cold. So I'm trying to think of something I could say. So I study the nitrogen cycle. I'm just going to give you like a 2-minute thing. So this is my favorite nitrogen cycle slide that I made up. The nitrogen cycle is really complicated, so students usually hate it. And it's complicated because there are lots of different forms of nitrogen in the ocean. And I studied most of these processes. This one, denitrification, is you take one form of nitrogen and you convert it to N2 gas. It's really important in areas where there's too much nitrogen. There's a lot of fertilizer going in, because nitrogen gas comes out into the environment and it's harmless, so it doesn't cause any problems. Nitrogen fixation is a very important process in the ocean. It's the only process that will take N2 gas and convert it into something that other organisms can use. Just like human beings, we can't use the nitrogen in the atmosphere, right? It's triple bonded, 2 nitrogens together. It's 78% of our atmosphere. But we have to eat protein in order to get our nitrogen. But there are a few organisms that live in marine systems and in terrestrial systems that are known as nitrogen fixers. And they can actually break apart. They can actually break apart that nitrogen. And that's the way to get new nitrogen into the ocean. And what's cool is my group was up here in August, and we think we made the first measurements ever of nitrogen fixation in the Arctic. Okay, so as a researcher, kind of what are my goals? One, and I think they're kind of standard goals for most people in positions like mine. I want to answer important questions. So there's a lot of things I'm interested in, but in terms of my field, you know, not everything is necessarily important or will advance the field. So you want to ask questions that are important. Very important, I want to keep everybody in my lab fed. So one thing that I don't think most people realize is that as a professor at a research institute or at any university, you're basically a small business owner, okay? So I need to hire people that will come in and help me do the research. I need to have money for my students so that they can get their degrees. And so how science is done, when I get to a little bit later on, all comes back to, as a researcher, I need to have the people in my lab to help me do the science, and in order to do that, I need to have budgets, I need to do long-term planning, short-term planning. So you're really a small business owner. And that's kind of a shock even to the people like me when I got my first lab, and I'm like, oh my God, this is what I'm doing now. And we don't really train our researchers in that like we should. I want to use my science in service to society, and I think this is actually fairly new. As a nitrogen researcher, I was very much into the basic side of research. You know, I was asking really fundamental questions, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But because I study nitrogen, there's a lot of applied problems that involve nitrogen. So a lot of my work now is in wastewater treatment plants, which bizarrely I think are really cool. If you study nitrogen, wastewater treatment plants are really cool. And nowadays, a lot of students, that's their focus. They want to do something that's going to have an application for society. And in a way, that's kind of a danger, because we need people that are just focused on the fundamental questions, as well as people that are focused on answering problems. And I'm going to, again, I'll get into that a little bit later. And then I think it's really important that all researchers be ambassadors for science. That's why if anybody ever asks me to give a talk like this, I always try to do it. Another thing that anybody at a university is a reviewer. So we review grant proposals and we review manuscripts. So if you think about research and the agencies that fund it, which I'm going to tell you about, there's not going to be people there that can evaluate what you're doing, right? There's only a handful of people in the world that can really evaluate some of the stuff I do. And I can evaluate some of the stuff that they do. So you need people that are experts in the field to review things. And in order to do that, there's this whole peer-reviewed system. Have you guys heard of the term peer review? So your peers are reviewing your work, and that's critical because they're really the only ones that know enough to do it. And so a big part of, I probably review 30 to 40 grant proposals or manuscripts a year. And you don't get paid for that. You don't have to do it. I mean, I know some people that don't. They're jerks. If you're a scientist, you need to do this. And it helps your science because you're learning kind of before anyone else sees it what people are thinking, and it's a good thing. It helps you learn more about what you're doing. So grant proposals are what to try to get work funded, and manuscripts are after the work is done, you're trying to publish it in peer-reviewed journals. Then a teacher and a mentor. So Rachel, this is Rachel, she's a postdoc. This is in the Gulf of Mexico. She's out on the ice right now. These are a couple of undergraduate students that I had in my marine science class. They're students at College of William and Mary, and this was on a cruise. So being a teacher and a mentor, again, very important. So what are my goals there? You want to be a positive, supportive role model. You want to make them employable, and that's a key thing, at least in marine science. There's a lot of students that want to do marine science. And yet they think of marine science as, you play with whales, you play with dolphins, and that's not what it is. And there's actually a lot of college programs, especially at smaller colleges, that are really fun. They do a lot of fun classes, but at the end, they're not going to be competitive for graduate school, which you really need to do in science. If you're going to go on, it really helps if you go on to graduate school. So try to focus on trying to give them the skills that are going to help them get a job or to get into grad school. And then the third one, encourage all students to value their abilities. And that kind of sounds like a no-brainer, but I think for science especially, it's important. People think of scientists, at least I did when I started out, I never thought I could be a researcher. I wanted to get my PhD, but I was going to try to work at a consulting firm or something because I wasn't smart enough to actually do research. That was in my head. Because I thought you had to be Einstein. You don't have to be a genius. You have to be creative. You have to be organized. Mostly you just have to be willing to work really, really hard and never give up. And I'll take a student who is tenacious and, maybe middle of the class than a straight A student who's going to get discouraged and start whining when the first thing goes wrong. So there's a lot of skills that go into science that have nothing to do with necessarily book learning and smarts. And that, at least, was a real revelation to me when I got into it. So I said, in order to get a lot of positions nowadays in science, you need a master's or a PhD. So how do you actually get that? The first thing is to find a major professor, and that's important because it involves money. So if you're a lawyer, or if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be a doctor, you go to a school, right? So we know that Harvard Law School is an excellent school. If you can get to Harvard Law, you're golden. Yale Medical School. So you want to try to get into a good school. Marine science is very different, and a lot of the basic sciences are very different. You are actually applying to a person because you're going to be working with that person, and you want to learn what they know. So it's a very different kind of thing. You can't just apply to a school. Other important thing about finding a major professor is that your major professor pays you. So unlike law school or medical school or an MBA program, you don't pay to go. You are paid to go. So we provide our students with a stipend, and then we cover their tuition. And so you could say, oh, that's like really on Easy Street. My dad was like, you know, there's all these students, you know, milking the system. If we did away with graduate stipends, so for what some students, they do take a really long time. And the thing is, that's not milking the system, that's like really stupid. Because as soon as they get out, if they get a job, they're gonna double or triple their salary. And so much, we couldn't afford to do science the way we do science in this country if we didn't have graduate students making these relatively low wages. And they work, I mean, when I was a graduate student, I worked all the time. Victoria, you got to back me up on it. Shake your head if I'm saying anything wrong. Because you just work all the time. I mean, the last 2 years of grad school, I don't think I took a weekend off. I was there from 6 in the morning. I would go home and eat dinner at around 5, and I was back at 6, and I worked until 2. I mean, it was crazy. So, but the other reason why we also pay students, whereas in some of the other fields, students don't pay, is and come out of school with a lot of debt, is because when they get out of school, they're going to make a lot of money. We are not going to make a lot of money. So there's a whole other system. So if you get into grad school, you have your major professor. You take classes, but you take very few classes. So graduate school isn't at all like undergraduate. Usually you'll spend the first year taking some classes, but the most important thing is you're going to develop a research project. And if you're a master's student, sometimes it's part of a larger project. If it's a PhD, it has to be a unique idea that you have come up with yourself. And so that takes a little while. I keep getting this again. That takes a little while for them to just kind of do a lot of reading, go to talks, kind of learn the field, and get an idea of what needs to be done, what would be a unique contribution. Then you develop your research project. For a master's student, you usually have a committee. So you have your major professor and you have 2 or 3 other committee members. They're at the institute or maybe an institute nearby. And they will help you with your project. So you want your committee members to have skills that your advisor doesn't have to kind of round out what you need to do. For a PhD, it's usually 4 or 5 additional people. Then you conduct the research, and then you have to defend the research. So you write up a thesis or a dissertation, and then you have to defend it. First, you have to defend it to the community. So you give a talk to the entire institute. Anyone can ask your question. And then you go into a room with your committee, and they basically pummel you for 2 to 4 hours, and you have to defend your work. And so that's how you actually get the degree. Okay, so then another role that students have to, researchers, faculty members at university have to have is they serve on committees. So I'm at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. We have a slew of committees. We have the admissions committee that's in charge of seeing who's going to come in. We have a faculty council. If you serve on that, it has to do with faculty issues of compensation. So there's a lot of committee work. And then there's a slew of other committees that I serve on. The Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry Committee is a national committee, and it was put together by NASA, NOAA, and the National Science Foundation to try to set priorities in carbon cycle science. And there's a lot of these kind of things. This is the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. I serve on the U.S. Advisory Committee for that, EPA. So researchers get pulled to serve on these various things if their expertise is needed. Again, you don't get paid for it. Sometimes your travel gets covered, sometimes it doesn't. But it's an honor to be asked, and it's like you just don't say no to these. Scientists usually belong to a society. So this is me with Hans Perl, who's just a good friend of mine. So I currently serve as the president of ASLO, which is the Association for the Sciences of Limnology, the word that nobody knows what it means, and Oceanography. And so scientific societies actually play kind of a key role because that's where we go and present our results. So usually once a year at least, all scientists go to one of these meetings. You give a 15 to 20 minute presentation on your work, and you go and you spend a week there and you listen to all these other presentations. And this is where you learn about what's going on in the field, you show your work to the community, and you get input for things. And so it's a real key thing. So, and then there's, it's run by a board. ASLO is run by a board, so you can be elected to the board. So that's one thing. Another thing that I do is I'm on the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. And this is an organization that the presidents of the various scientific societies, I think there's 1.25 million scientists are represented by this body. We meet in DC twice a year, and we try to deal with bigger picture issues in science for the science community and advocate for different issues within the sciences. And one of the things we said is we need scientists to get out there and talk to people. So they'll be very pleased I'm giving this talk. That's the job of a university researcher or a researcher at a private institute. Wears a lot of different hats in addition to what you think of as just doing the research. So okay, so how is science done in the country? The big picture. So we have a national science agenda that is put together, and it's with Congress, with a lot of subcommittees that are looking at what the priorities are in research. So that's kind of at the national part. So then for the individual researcher, you have to have an idea. You write a proposal. The proposal goes through peer review. Once you get funded, you do research publication. You actually do the research. This is a typo. And then you do peer review publication. I'm kind of going to work my way through each one of these. So the first thing is what science even gets funded. How do you get funded? So Congress, and this is that setting the big picture issues. Congress sets the large-scale budgets and divides the money between the various agencies. So agencies, and when they look at that, they're going to divide it up between basic versus applied research. So basic, and I'm going to actually just go to the next thing. So the National Science Foundation is the basic research arm for our country. And it's massive. I think its budget isn't as high as it should be. It's like $7 billion, something like that, is the budget for the National Science Foundation. And this is the organization that funds basic research. So not necessarily thinking, gosh, is anything going to come out of this in the next decade? But at the fundamental level, this is the kind of research that, for example, a company could never afford to do, right? A company needs to, if they need to do experiments, they need to do something that in a couple of years is going to give them a payoff, right? Or they would never stay in business. So the National Science Foundation is funding the work that is kind of fundamental to a lot of different aspects of our society, because really the government's the only one with enough money to do that. And then there's a whole, and the thing about the National Science Foundation is that a lot of the work there ends up as dead ends. I'll just be honest. It's kind of things that are risky, again, things that a company could never afford to fund. So you end up hitting a lot of brick walls. I just found this a while ago, and I thought it was this cool thing. But what's key is the ones that actually break through, the ones that have enormous payoffs. You never know what that's going to be. The important thing behind it is, though, you are kind of trying to spread the money around in all these various areas because you don't know what is going to be the big payoff. Then there are the mission agencies. The mission agencies are things like the Institute of Health, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, NASA, the U.S. Geological Survey, NOAA, the Environmental Protection Agency. These mission agencies, they are charged with addressing specific questions. But again, the key thing about these agencies is they all depend on the research that's done at NSF for their work. So the other thing that's key about the National Science Foundation is things like health and defense. That has an emotional connection to everybody, right? My mother died 2 years ago of cancer. So if you tell me you want to increase the budget for cancer research, I'm going to say you should do that.
I want this.
Right. Everyone wants to feel safe in their country, right? And so if you say you're going to increase the defense budget, people are like, okay. And one of the problems, though, is both of those agencies really rely, again, on the basic foundational research that's done at NSF. And I'm spending so much time on it, though, because it's a hard thing to get people to support, because it seems kind of pie in the sky. And yet, if we don't support that, the whole pile kind of collapses. National Science Foundation is really critical to all aspects of science in the country. And yet it's the one I think that gets the least attention in the public. Okay, so what science gets funded? So Congress sets these agendas in terms of the big budget, and then they divvy out that money to all the different agencies. Then the agencies solicit proposals. So they send out this proposal. So researchers write proposals. Proposals are 15 pages. The proposal, it starts off with, well, what's the question you're going to address? What do we know about that? So kind of reviewing the literature that's already out there. How are you going to address it? So it's, you need to put your methods and basic idea of experimental design. And then you need to say, well, why is this even important? if you were writing a NOAA proposal, the importance needs to be a very specific application. For an NSF proposal, you need to show how it's going to advance our understanding of some basic process. And then you also include with that a budget. So you have to say, well, it's going to cost me this much money to do this work. I'm going to need, you know, 1 student, 6 months of research technician time, 1 month of my salary. It's going to be 6 trips to the Arctic for 4 people, so you have to do this budget, and then you send that off. Once that agent, in this case, the National Science Foundation gets that, they send it out to peer review, and that's where they send proposals out to people like me. So that's that reviewing aspect. You read it, you write an evaluation on it. Is it an important question? Do we already know the answer? Does anybody care if we know the answer? Does the experiment sound rational? So then scientists review these proposals and they send them back in, rating them and telling them, yes, yes, they're doing this good. And also, not only rating them in terms of helping to see what gets funded, but you also want to improve that, right? So if they're missing things, you want to tell them. And you would think science works best when people are a little altruistic about it. So, you know, did you think of this? You need to think of this. Maybe, you know, have you considered this paper? So you try to also improve the proposal. So if it doesn't get funded, which it usually doesn't, it can go back in as a stronger proposal. So then the agency, in this case it was NSF, assembles a panel of experts to review proposals. And then again, it's just people from the community. So one of the things, I mean, I've been on a number of review panels. So those review panelists get together, and for the chemical oceanography was the most recent one I did. There's like 6 of us, and we had, I think, 60 proposals. Each person takes 20, I think we had to read, and you look at all the reviews, you do your own review, and you kind of sit around and discuss pros and cons, and you put recommendations forth to the agency. Then the panel makes recommendations of what they think it should be funded, and then the funding agency makes the final decisions, and then hopefully you get a good phone call and you scream, or you get the wah 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 and you didn't get funded. So what happens once the science is funded? You receive the money and you start planning for the research. We go out, we make our observations, or we conduct our experiments, then we analyze the data and we start preparing manuscripts of the results. Somewhere in there is when we would go to science meetings, present it, try to get input from other people, kind of see who liked it, and then maybe you could suggest those as a reviewer. That's the whole, again, that you don't know to do in the beginning. And then you submit it to a research journal. So then the journal sends out the manuscript again to people like me. So we are reviewing those papers. We say, is this a valid approach? Did they do it the right way? Have they interpreted their data correctly? Do their conclusions make sense? Then you send it back in, those reviews, and then the journal decides, is it published or not? And again, you get either a really happy phone call or the wah wah wah, and you know, you gotta redo it. One thing that you hear a lot not a lot, but you hear sometimes, you know, this publish or perish. And oftentimes in the general public, it sounds like a bad thing. It's like, oh, you have to publish or perish. And yet, it's true. If we don't publish our work, we might as well not even have done it, right? It's just an enormous waste of the taxpayers' money. So this whole thing, publish or perish, that we really kind of beat on each other about, you gotta publish it or you might as well never have done it. So if you ever hear that phrase, it's a good thing. We need to be really serious about that. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about in terms of science funding and supporting science. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that there's hard money in science and there's something called soft money in science. And that hard money means that my salary is guaranteed by the institute. But like all postdocs, anybody that's a research scientist usually, and a lot of institutes are mostly research scientists, they're soft money. Being soft money, it means they have to generate 100% of their salary with grants or they don't get paid. And one of the things that's important about this from at the national level is we can spend, to train a PhD student, you spend a couple $100,000 because they're going to be with you for 5 to 6 to 7 years. You're paying them that time, you're taking them to meetings, you're paying for their research. And if at the national level we suddenly say, okay, we're going to tighten our belt and we're going to, you know, cut back funding for, you know, 3, 4, 5 years, but then we'll put that money back into the budget, if you do that with science, basic researchers like this, you will drive them to another field because you can't, they're the most vulnerable part of the whole scientific enterprise. You spend all this money training them, and then if you don't have the grant support to actually keep them funded so that they can pay their mortgage and feed their kids, they will leave the field. And that's a loss that you're not going to get back. It's a one-way street normally. So what are some of the big challenges? One, I think we need to educate and this is big challenges for science in general. We need to educate voters, we need to think about return on investment, and we need to talk about the image of science in the public. So one thing is educating voters and those they vote for, which is one of the reasons why I like talking to people just about how science is done. In terms of return on investment, so things like jobs, quality of life, national security, that's what people in America, I think, are kind of three big things that everybody's worried about, right? We all need jobs, we all want a good quality of life, and we want to be secure. We want to make sure that our country is safe, and all of that is dependent on research, but sometimes it's hard to actually show just what, say, a given grant will do. So one example of this that came up in a meeting I was at, where they were talking about, well, how about lasers? So these are some of the early grants that they had on lasers. And this I just downloaded from the National Science Foundation website. So measurement of low absorbency by gas lasers. And this was done back in 1965, where nobody really knew what lasers were. Or the Rayleigh scattering of a laser beam by liquids, like yawn. That's the kind of thing now that Rush Limbaugh makes fun of. You know, why would we ever be doing anything like that? Well, just as one example, this is what annually lasers and laser technology contribute to our economy. In the transportation sector alone, $1 trillion. Telecom, e-commerce, and the IT sector is $4 trillion. So these really basic fundamental grants that may not seem like, why would we ever care about that? Over time, they're what's feeding into this kind of work. And that is really fueling our economy. So again, scientists need to get better at showing these kind of connections. And another big problem is the image that people have of science. Have you guys seen The Big Bang Theory? It's really funny. But can you guess what the one person on the screen is who's not a scientist is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the hot blonde. She's a waitress who wants to be an actress. This is a serious problem. We are gonna, what's the 27% growth in STEM fields. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. The future of jobs in America are people that are going to be skilled in those. And yet you've got, you know, junior high kids that are trying to figure out, oh, what do I want to be when I grow up, in high school kids. You want to be her. You want to be, I mean, these guys are incredibly geeky. I've never met anyone as geeky as these guys. And I've been in science 20 years. But that's what the image of people have. Here, this was, just to illustrate the problem, so this was the Fermi Lab brought in, I believe these were 7th graders. And these before pictures are, they had a whole bunch of students come in and they wanted them to draw a scientist. So this is what they drew for scientists. Look at this guy. He's like toxic gas coming out of a beaker. And then they had him they had this program at the Fermi Lab where they were interacting with real scientists, and at the end of the program they wanted them to draw what they thought of a scientist looked like. And look it, isn't she hip? It's very cool. And I love this one. You probably can't read it. It says, "Hello, I'm a regular person." So this is a revelation, and this is a problem because scientists are just regular people. We're not like geniuses. We're not, I mean, a lot of us are geeky.
My mom
So, anyways, this is, I think, a real big problem. We need to change the perception of what scientists are like, because we are just regular people. This is our job. And it's a really fun job. You know, it's a hard job, but it's a fun job. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is precision. So it's both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. So one really bad thing about scientists are, in our papers, the way we present things, in our talks, we have to say things very precisely. You have to be that precise so that somebody 2 years later can look at your data and be like, oh, okay, well there is a little different, oh, but this is why. So that's a good thing for a scientist, but when you are talking to Congress, whether you're talking or when you're talking to a newspaper, especially for things like climate change, if you're that precise, you're losing everybody, right? And so scientists are walking this very fine line between being precise how we're trained to be and being able to speak generally enough that we can actually say something to the general public and talk to the people that need the information that we have.